Talking about. Joining us, Democratic strategist and pollster and MS Now political analyst Cornell Belcher. Sam Stein still with us. Cornell, how do things look?
Well, I think right now it's still a tough map. I think, though, atmospherically, Trump and his policies have opened the doorway for us to even begin having this conversation. Because if you look at what's happening, particularly with independent voters, and in a lot of these battleground states, what you're talking about is which way are independent voters shifting. Depending on the poll that you're looking at, Donald Trump on handling most of the major issues that independent voters care about, he's underwater by better than 20 points on whether it's the economy or inflation, these affordability, and his overall approval numbers have hit an all-time low. So the moderate middle swath of the electorate is moving away from Trump and his presidency, and that's made really tough for Republicans because Trump continues to be the center of all the news conversations. Look, as a Democrat, I've seen Democrat numbers move up and down, although I've never seen them sink like this. But Democrats could always distance themselves from the top of the ticket. Trump makes it really hard for Republicans to distance themselves from the top of the ticket, and I think that's opening up this conversation.
I wonder, when you look at the races that are currently now in play, you've got Maine for Susan Collins' seat. That's been long desired by Democrats. You have Texas, obviously, also long desired. Ohio is an interesting place because you have a very popular former, or at least he was a very popular former senator running again. If you're looking at all these races, Cornell, which ones are you most hopeful about? And I would also, even though we're not seeing it here, I would also include Iowa, because that's an open seat to replace Joni Ernst.
Well, open seats are always opportunities because, as you know, Katie, look, it's hard to be an incumbent, and the vast majority of incumbents win re-election. So if it's an open seat, it becomes a real battle. But if you look at North Carolina, and I'll give kudos to Senate Democrats and Chuck Schumer for recruiting, because a lot of these races comes down to the candidate. Well, we can talk about a lot of outside atmospheric, but if you don't have a good candidate, it's hard to win. Democrats have good candidates in all these seats. Even in Alaska, right, Democrats have landed a good candidate. And when you look at North Carolina with popular former Governor Cooper, they're deciding to run for Senate, and Democrats have recruited Roy Cooper to run for Senate. That's going to be a hard seat for Republicans to hold on to. Again, going into an open seat scenario, and you have a very popular former Democratic governor there in that state where people talk about all the good things they saw him do as governor, and he left the governors, on the plus side. I think that is a really tough seat for them to hold on to there, and purplish North Carolina.
Let me ask you, Sam, about Alaska, because Lisa Murkowski obviously has been really interesting during the Trump years. When there have been votes against Donald Trump, usually it's come from her and a couple others. She's also flirted with the idea of becoming an independent. If the race in Alaska against Mary Peltola gets tougher for her in the coming months, do you think it's out of the question for her to take up that interest in becoming an independent again?
Well, it's Dan Sullivan who's running against Peltola.
I'm sorry, wrong. I'm sorry.
It's okay. No worries. I'm here to help. But you do raise an interesting point about Murkowski, which is she has been independent-minded. The state is not like totally unconventional. Obviously, it's voted heavily Republican, but there are enough people up there who are independent-minded as well. And then on top of that, there's been some reported overtures from Senator Schumer about whether or not she'd be willing to switch parties. Now, who knows what happens in the next year or so? I don't think it's all that likely, but it's not totally unplausible for her to be sort of tempted by the idea. And certainly Donald Trump's done very little to make her feel courted, right? I mean, he's gone out of his way. He's bashed her. He's forced her to take incredibly tough votes. There's been a couple instances where he's helped her out. For instance, on the Big Beautiful Bill, there were some carve-outs for Alaska in there. But she seems increasingly like she's a senator without necessarily an easy party to fit into. And in a situation where the Senate is really tight, let's say it's 50-50, you can see a real play being made for her to actually switch parties. And there is precedent for this happening in the past. Long ago, Jim Jeffords of Vermont switched during the early George W. Bush administration, tilted the power of the Senate. Not saying it's going to happen, but these conversations do happen.
Oh, okay. I'm a little embarrassed about that. Lisa Murkowski flub. She's not running again until 2028. I'm sorry about that.
Hey.
I got my 8s and my 6s mixed up.
It's your first. It's the first mistake I've ever seen you make. So this is we're here for history.
Honey, you haven't been paying attention. Cornel, I guess what is the big concern for you as we face November? I mean, right now Donald Trump and the party are really not doing well, and as you mentioned, it's really hard to run against or away from Donald Trump when you are in the Republican Party. Do you see any pitfalls for Democrats, potential pitfalls? Sam was talking earlier about how this really should be not a race about Democratic ideas. That should come in December, but instead a race where the Democrats focus on Donald Trump's failures. After all, usually midterms are recall elections.
Yeah. Well, Sam's pretty smart. And by the way, it was a good bluff. We ended up having a great conversation about Lisa Murkowski, which we'll have again. I guarantee you, if it's 50-50. But yeah, there are pitfalls, and part of that pitfall is, look, Democrats. It's not like voters have grown in love with Democrats, right? And you look at the ceiling is, the floors fall out under Republicans, but especially with independent voters. But if you look at Democratic sort of favorability and approval numbers, they're not that great. So and young voters who always been a big part of our ability to get massive turnout. The young voters are still drifting more independent and certainly not falling in love with Democrats. However, to that broader point, this is going to be a referendum on Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is hoping Democrats make this a referendum on him. If I were a Republican, I'd be hoping that Donald Trump pulls back and pulls away and stops dominating the news, so they can actually have a conversation about some of their policy ideas. Although, if you look at what Congress has passed, Katie, they haven't passed anything that the public likes or massively improves of, but it becomes a better contest for them if it's not a referendum on Donald Trump. But right now, it's looking like it's a referendum on Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is helping Democrats make that case.